Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today, we finally made it to the big one. I'm talking about album number 5 from Tangerine Dream, Phaedra. Well, I think we've officially made it to the moment in the series that everyone's been most eagerly waiting for. After 4 albums that leaned pretty far into the experimental sides of electronic and krautrock crossover that can get pretty mixed opinions from core fans of the band today, Tangerine Dream ended up signing to Virgin Records. Apparently the label head Richard Branson came across them himself after hearing some then unreleased recordings, which I think I will be getting to in a different video. The band had slowly been moving in a progressively better developed and more accessible sound with each of their previous albums, but this 5th album in 1974 finally completed that experimental transition period into the electronic ambient sound you probably know them for today. Much more accessible and melody-centric than any of their previous outings, and featuring their first ever exposure to the Moog synthesizer alongside the same Mellotron and VCS3 keyboards and synths they'd been working with before. Although still sticking pretty heavily to a very abstract and ambient sound, it's not difficult to tell that this came from the same band who made an album like Sight. But just that slightly more accessible and melodic turn, as well as presumably the greater promotion provided by the major label they just signed to, resulted in easily their most successful endeavor yet. If I'm not mistaken, this is still their best-selling album to this day. It's truly a massive landmark for all of electronic music, and one of the very first albums to focus on an all-electronic sound that, could be marketable to a wider audience. At this point, Kraftwerk hadn't even released Autobahn yet. That wouldn't come until later that same year. Arguably, this is the point at which the entire genre of electronic music really first broke out to a mainstream audience. And it's still consistently brought up in discussions of the all-time greatest electronic albums ever made. Now, there are a number of other projects they came out with afterwards that I personally prefer over this one. I currently own 4 Tangerine Dream albums on CD, and this is not one of them. I can't say that Phaedra ever rose to the ranks of one of my, personal all-time favorites in all of electronic music. Although, even if I believe they have better projects than this is still up there with their best. I'd say it's their first properly great album, and one of the most obvious starting points I'd recommend for people first trying to get into them for the first time. For the most part, I agree with all the hype this one's amassed. It's a pretty unbelievably impressive effort for them to have pulled off an album like this, especially back in the early 70s before synthesizer technology had really advanced enough to become easy for ordinary people to use. Back then, they were running into all sorts of weird problems with their equipment as they were still learning how it worked. So many things went wrong behind the scenes, from their speakers being damaged by their own bass notes, to tape machines and mixing consoles breaking down altogether, even before they got most of their stuff committed to tape at all. And programming the sequencers was way more difficult too, not just because they hadn't used them before, but also because this was from the days before synths had presets or memory banks to save specific settings. Everything had to be, rewired painstakingly by hand. Getting all their machines in tune with each other took 2 entire weeks of working non-stop nearly all day, before even recording anything. But the entire album was somehow recorded rather quickly in under 6 weeks, mostly thanks to the improvisational approach to their sound that they'd continued sticking to. All these compositions were put together mostly on the fly, and recorded in single takes without any edits. These guys were breaking entirely new ground for the way music was being made. And as for how the music itself plays out, while the improvisational approach to the compositions predictably result in some fairly long-winded tracks that progress very slowly, it's all consistently captivating from start to finish. Continuing the pattern from their earlier albums, the album only has 4 tracks, but they all add something specific of substance. Obviously, the biggest story is the 17.5-minute title track, which has the most dimensionality and interesting evolutions. At first starting with about a minute of ghostly clouds of dark ambience that lack a strong melody but feel very light and ethereal and immersive, then building into various synth arpeggios fading in and out and bleeping away at high speed, slowing down but eventually forming a consistent rhythmic backbone by the 2-minute mark. The melody is rather disorienting and dissonant at first as it floats up and down in pitch, but as some Mellotron choir sounds are introduced about 3 minutes in, the track feels like it forms more of a traditional melodic foundation, and all the pieces finally coalesce together, with other more violin-like filtered Mellotrons coming in later to give the track a more standard lead melody. A little before the 5-minute mark, everything in the mix gives way for some synth arpeggios that more resemble like electric bass guitars. Actually, those might just be electric bass guitars. But the arpeggios continually change shape as other pads and other arpeggios whoosh past to really further that well-layered and spacey trance-like effect. The subspace created here carries over the entire following several minutes, with the bass arpeggios being joined by occasional odd psychedelic effects coming and going at various intervals, as well as very subtly changing and wavering in pitch. Some of which apparently wasn't even entirely intentional, as the machines themselves overheating could result in those subtle pitch changes on their own. Eventually, a little after the 10-minute mark, it sounds like the composition completely stops dead, building into a completely different cloud of dark ambience and odd clanking noises. Those fade away to give way to all these odd squeaking sounds that sound kind of like seagulls or something being placed over more airy mellotron choir pads. And there's other strange and spooky evolutions until we finally get to the last major section of the track at the 14.5-minute mark, as the mellotrons get particularly dramatic sounding and imposing, filling out a lot more of the mix until somewhat abruptly fading out in the last minute with a near silent spooky outro tacked on at the end. Yeah, this entire track lives up to every bit of hype that people give it. It feels huge and cosmic and spooky and evokes the vastness of space, but also feels much more welcoming and easily approachable than any of their other previous attempts at evoking that feeling of open vastness. As well as markedly more futuristic. This is still the kind of thing that would make perfect sense scoring some kind of science fiction movie taking place in the year 2070 or whatever. Unsurprisingly, it is the best track out of all four, though that's certainly not to take away from any of the other pieces which hold up very well in their own right. Mysterious Semblance at the Strand of Nightmares is a near 10-minute composition focused entirely on Edgar Fruse's mellotron performances, with some very slight help from his wife Monique Fruse doing some filtering effects on a phasing device, apparently. This track isn't nearly as multidimensional as the title track, but it is arguably a deeper emotional moment, as all the mellotron strings just deliver a very straightforward, I guess classical-influenced piece, floating through some deeper and more openly melancholy chord progressions, and the occasional filtering effects that still cement that spacey electronic aesthetic. This is admittedly probably the track on the album most likely to fall into the background for me, but anytime I do give it my full attention, I am consistently struck by its simplistic and straightforward beauty. I mean, it's pretty hard to go wrong with mellotrons. Though I'm even more of a fan of the following cut, Movements of a Visionary, which gets much more into the sequencer-heavy arrangements that made the title track so striking, and maybe even more easily memorable than that track. The core blipping arpeggio underscoring that track is probably the moment of the album that most easily stuck in my head and set off the nostalgia flags from when I first got into this band in high school. The composition may obviously not have as much evolution as the title track again, but the mix of that core arpeggio with some occasional organ and various other electronic effects whooshing around are really alluring and enveloping. And then finally, the album closes with Sequence C, a solo recorder piece from Peter Baumann with slight tape delay that only stretches on for a very brief 2 minutes. The length of the piece probably makes it my least favorite on the album by default, although it's still very effective for what it is. Even if recorders can sometimes be an annoying and shrill instrument, they're being manipulated to sound like this very peaceful, minimal flute piece that feels very warm and comforting and meditative. Despite how scant it is, it's a far better closer than that of either of their previous 2 albums, and maybe even more satisfying a closer than Alpha Centauri, at least delivering more of a sense of actual closure. But that's everything on Phaedra. I mean, you really don't need me to tell you that this is an all-time classic. You probably already knew that before clicking on this video. I have a suspicion this is going to be the most popular video in this series, and I mean, this album's popularity is well-deserved. Again, there are other albums elsewhere in their catalog that I personally enjoy more than it, and there are other albums from fellow synth pioneers that I hold a lot more close to me personally. Obviously not just Kraftwerk, who are about to prove this genre's commercial viability way more a short few months later, but also something like Jean-Michel Jarre's Oxygen, which would follow this album's lead a few years later. I personally feel something like that is aged significantly better and sounds a lot more advanced than this. But this album, as simplistic and stripped back as it might feel compared to other projects that would come later on the same scene, or even later in their own catalog, still has all of its original core appeal intact nearly 50 years later. It may not exactly sound new, but it doesn't sound dated either. It's like it's the kind of thing that's existed forever, and the formulas set down by this album are still closely followed and iterated upon to this day. There's a reason it's continually held in as high regard as it is, and it keeps getting revisited all these decades later, either by fans or other artists, or the band themselves who re-recorded this album from the ground up on multiple separate occasions in the 2000s and later. We will not be talking about those versions. But yeah, I mean, Phaedra may not be my personal favorite Tangerine Dream album, but it's unquestionably one of their best. An obvious favorite of many others for good reason, and again, their first album that I would consider properly great. I'm overall feeling a solid 8 out of 10 on it. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters. They're awesome people. You want to add yourself to that list, link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.